Hey, and how are you doing? Welcome to this new 3D Pilot tutorial where I will be showing you how to render in SolidWorks using the Photoview 360 add-in. Now, most of the things I'll be showing are not only applicable to Photoview 360, but can be used with Keyshot or any other rendering program. This tutorial will be in two parts. In this first part, I will be showing you some examples of renders, both good and bad, and show you some techniques to make your renders more attractive and more clear. At the end of this video, I will be showing you some easy to understand do's and don'ts to keep in mind while you're rendering. In the second part, I will be doing a live example in SolidWorks and show you where to find all the settings and how they relate to your render. For this, I will be doing a live screencast and explain what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Disclaimer: I do not own most of the images in this presentation, nor do I own the rights to use them. All credits go to the image's respective owner. When criticizing a render, this is only done to explain how these images can be made more attractive and clear, not just to be a jerk towards the creator. I apologize beforehand if any of my comments may be taken as disrespectful. So to tackle making an attractive looking render, I divided the process up in 3 steps. Step 1 is to define your goal. What do you want to do with this render? What is the message and who is it for? Step 2 is to add a camera to your scene and to adjust its location, focal length and other properties. In step 3 we will change lighting and materials to make the most of our render, and also I will be showing you some tips to make your renders more realistic. So step 1 is to define your goal. There are many ways to show your product or details of it. Keep in mind that rendering is a little more time consuming than making a print screen. Renders should be used for presentation towards others, not just because they can or because they look cool. As a product developer, I came across 3 main types of renders. There's form and shape renders, as I like to call them, where you want to make a clear presentation of the shape and the colors of your product or of a certain detail. There are system renders, where the main goal is to explain how a mechanical working principle works, what moves, what parts are related to each other. And there's presentation renders, where you want your product to come across as very attractive, as very realistic. The focus here is on lighting, composition, making a mood for your product that fits its function or that fits its users. Designers often use sketches to explore the possibilities in form, shape and color. Sketches can be very dynamic and should show the forms of a product clearly. When the product you want to render is still in an early stage of design and you want to communicate how the product as a whole looks, you want your image to be well lit, clear and not cluttered. Use an environment with neutral lighting that doesn't leave too much shadows or highlights. So the second main theme is system renders. One way to show a system is to make an exploded view, show the complexity, show the parts that all fit together neatly. While these types of renders can be very impressive and look like they were made by someone who is very capable technically, it is not a good way to explain how your product actually works. These kind of images are cluttered, hard to understand, and not easily read by your audience. There are a couple of ways to reduce the amount of clutter and to show the inner workings of your awesome machine more clearly. I'll give you one example of a better way to show a system or a subsystem. This is a section view of a smoothie making machine that I designed last year. Let's say I want to show you what that black box looking thing is, what it's for and how it relates to the other components. First I make 2 renders, one of the whole product, so the whole vending machine, and one from the same camera angle of the black box and the components that relate to it directly. These 2 renders are overlaid in an image editor as 2 different layers, with the full product render at the back and mostly transparent. This shows where in the product these parts are located and how they relate. Then I can go in closer and make detailed renders showing the ways things are mounted, things fit together and how things move. This 2-step approach makes your system easier to understand by your audience, no matter if it's a friend, a colleague or your professor. Keep in mind to strip the system of all components that are not essential to the working principle. Use colors to differentiate different components and show multiple poses when things are able to move in your assembly. The most interesting to look at, most attractive renders are presentation renders. This is where a designer shows off a product as if he or she were to sell it on the market. You want to show your product fitting in the mood with the environment that your product will be presented in. Yet we come across a lot of presentation renders that are on a grayish background with a flat studio lighting. While very clear to read, these images lack any form of mood. They are not interesting to look at. They don't attract much attention. Now I'm not saying that simple white backgrounds should never be used. Here are 2 examples that I think look very sexy and very interesting. What differs these renders from the ones that I just showed you are 3 main things. The lighting is much more interesting, as we have sharp highlights and sufficient shadows and contrast. The subjects, in this case the backpack and the car, are quite intricately designed and have a lot of detail themselves. And the materials are more interesting and feel very lifelike. A good way to make an image more appealing to look at is to add people, faces or hands to your render. They add a lot of realism and make the product look more as if you can touch it right there. An added bonus is that your viewer has a better sense for scale of your product and how it will be used. You can even take this a step further and place your product in the environment you want it to be promoted, sold or used in. You do this by searching or taking a photo yourself, matching the perspective and lighting of your render to the photo, and then combining the two in an image editing software where you blend the seams between the real photo and the fake render. Lighting can make a huge difference in the attractiveness of your product. These parts you see here are basically just grey, dull boxes, but the lighting in this case makes them look very premium and luxurious. Imagine these on a white background with the studio lighting and nobody would even look at them twice. Here is a nice example of a very bright and happy render. Well-lit renders are combined with water splashes and pictures of playing toddlers. The exact form and working principle comes second to the joy of playing with splashing water in the tub. So for step 2 we will be adding a camera to the scene. Now we won't plop the camera randomly into space and point it at the product. Making renders is much like real-life product photography, and here are some guidelines you should follow to make the most out of your render. First, the 3D location of your camera in space and where it points at. Then we will adjust the field of view of the camera, so basically how much perspective we want to have. Then the depth of field, so that's using the focus of our camera to highlight detail and add realism. I'll also be saying a word about resolution, render quality, and give you some tips for added realism in your renders. So by angle I mean where to add your camera in the scene and where to point it, to make a good render. Good use of camera position and angle can give your viewer clues about the physical size of your product and how to use it. Also, changing the camera position has a great influence on the composition of an image. I will only give an example at the end of the video, because I think composition deserves a video on its own. Take this race buggy as an example. Here you see an often used angle, from the top onto the front and to the left of the object. There is almost no perspective warping going on. This makes the race car look very small, like a toy. You can't imagine sitting yourself in the seat and grabbing the wheel to drive off into the dunes. Here on the left is an example of a better angle. The camera is placed at eye level, which is about 1.7 meters or 5 foot 6 inches above the ground. Here you get the view as if you're stepping right next to the cockpit, ready to get in. On the right the camera is almost touching the ground. This makes the buggy look a lot bigger and mightier. It looks more brute, more manly. This low camera is also used with superheroes a lot to make them look more powerful. Next up is the field of view. Basically it is the amount of perspective that a camera shows. For this, SolidWorks, like many other 3D programs, uses a certain lens type in millimeters. Values range from 24mm, which gives you a fisheye kind of perspective, while bigger lens types, like the 200mm one, show little to no perspective at all. Imagine sitting really far from your product and using a big zoom lens. You can also tick off the perspective box, which will give you an orthographic view, with no perspective at all. I recommend always using perspective, except when making system renders or showing the front, side or top view of your product. So as I said, the field of view changes the perspective warping of your image. By using it correctly, you can give your viewer clues about the size and use of your product. I'll give you an example. Here I have a model of a blender, rendered with no perspective at all. This is the same as using a lens that is infinitely big, as if it were kilometers away and using a telescope. This looks very unrealistic. Here I'm using a 50mm lens, which is about the same amount of perspective as our eyes have. This feels a lot more natural, and you can imagine grabbing the handle and pushing the button on this blender. Here I'm using an extremely small lens, I think 5mm if I remember correctly. As you can see, the blender looks very distorted. A lens this small should really never be used, except maybe for sport action driven dynamic renders. I recommend using a value between 18mm, which is about the angle a GoPro has, and 80mm, which is slightly zoomed in with the standard camera. In real life, cameras always have a focal point. Everything behind or in front of this focal point is blurred, out of focus. In rendering, however, having everything in focus at once is possible. Sometimes you can see almost no difference in depth of field, and it can be neglected, but in some cases you can use it to your advantage and add some blurring to highlight a certain detail or to add some realism. Imagine making this render and you want to highlight the 5th button from the left. Here I used a very small depth of field as well as a little color. You can see that only the highlighted button is rendered clearly, everything else seems less important. Setting a small depth of field creates lots of blurring. This can be used with close-ups and very small products, as this happens with real cameras as well. A larger depth of field means more of the image is in focus. This can be used to add just a touch of realism to your render. So now I want to say something about resolution, quality and some tricks for adding realism to your render. I will be using this render as a starting point. It is a simple form. Imagine it as a special doorknob or something, whatever you like. The first thing to notice is the low resolution. Resolution is in this case the amount of pixels that make up the whole image. Here it is way too low. The whole image looks like it's a little bit soft and pixelated. Here it is in higher resolution and you can clearly see the difference between the two. So in the render options, set the render resolution higher to a value that's more appropriate to what you will be using this render for. In the near future I will be making a video all about resolution with a lot of examples of good resolutions to use in certain cases. Next up is resolution again, but not of the rendered image, but of the 3D model itself. As you can see, the rings on this knob are supposed to be round, but instead they appear as many-sided polygons. When rendering, and only rendering, you should bring up the amount of subdivisions SolidWorks uses to display a model. Here you can clearly see the difference between the two. When rendering, and only when rendering, you should bring up the amount of subdivisions SolidWorks uses to display a model, until you can no longer see the jagged lines effect. You do this under the document properties, under image quality, by sliding this top slider to the right. Bring the slider back when modeling or working on your scene, as more subdivisions means your computer has to work a lot harder to display the model and may slow down significantly. Next, I added some small roundings to all the sharp edges. In real life, 100% sharp edge is not possible, not even on a razor blade. So why should we use this sharpness in our renders? One way to do this is to fillet all the edges. This, however, is a lot of work, creates a lot of extra geometry to deal with and slows your PC down quite a bit. A better way is to go to the material settings of your products, go to the Advanced tab and change the round sharp edges value to something between 0.1 and 1 mm, depending on the size of your product. This way Photoview will use some digital trickery with the lighting and shading of your model to make it look as if there were fillets without creating the extra geometry. This gives your lights a nice opportunity to reflect off these edges and give you little highlights everywhere sharp edges occur. Next, I added a little bit of depth of field. In this case I chose a bigger depth, so the effect is not very noticeable. It does however look a little more realistic and pleasing to look at. Another nice feature of Photoview 360 is to add bloom. Bloom is the soft glow around very bright things that you can see when taking a picture of, for example, the moon at night. Here I added some light-emitting materials to the inside of the rings. Without bloom they look just like white rings. But turning on the bloom, however, your mind is tricked into believing that the rings are actually lit up very brightly. Use bloom on your models when you have things that emit lights, such as displays or LEDs, or when you have very bright highlights that you want to exaggerate. To add bloom, you first render the image as usual, and then in the Photoview 360 window to the right of your rendered image, under Image Processing, tick the bloom box. Lower the bloom set point and play with the bloom extent, so that's how far the glow reaches, until you are happy with the result. Now about the render quality setting. SolidWorks gives you the possibility to render with good, better, best and maximum quality. I will not be covering the custom settings for the moment. As an example, here you have the blender from a previous example, rendered in the lowest good quality settings, as well as rendered with a maximum quality setting. As I flick between them, notice the black spots appearing in the transparent parts, as well as the shadows on the buttons and on the base of the units. Imagine the camera shooting light rays towards the transparent object and calculating all the refraction and all the reflection that's going on. When using the good setting, these rays can only go to 4 or so transparent layers of an object. So they go into the material, come back out, go back into the material at the rear and come back out again. Wherever there are transparent or any surfaces behind these 4 layers, it renders just black. So when you're using a lot of transparent objects, you may want to increase the quality of setting. Another difference is the shadows becoming clearer and cleaner. It takes more calculations but results in more pleasing shadows. But as you can see, there is another really big difference between these two renders. That is the time it took to render. On good settings it only took 24 seconds, while the maximum setting took well over 8 minutes. This brings me to a very important note. Rendering is expensive. When increasing resolution and render quality, you often spend hours rendering images that are only slightly better than images rendered on a lower quality setting, but that took only a few minutes to render. Always think about what quality you really need. It is often not worth waiting for hours or spending hundreds of bucks for a better PC hardware to render just a little bit faster. It is worth a lot more to work on your model itself, camera angles and lighting, than it is worth to sit behind your PC waiting for it to render an image that has top quality shadows and reflections, but that is still quite boring to look at. Use the time that you have for rendering wisely, as you can easily get tangled up waiting for hours without much results. To make an image that is more attractive to look at, it is important to think about the look and feel, the mood that your picture will have. This mood is created by changing the lights, changing the background and changing where shadows and highlights hit. Let me give you some examples of moods and styles that you can give to your renders. Here we use a simple colorless background. The subject is cleanly framed inside the borders of the picture, using some simple perspective, lots of light and little shadows. This type of render is really clean and really clear. You clearly show what your product is and how it looks. But that's about it. This type of render can easily be very boring and uninteresting. Even with this awesome looking sports car, there's little perspective and extremely soft lighting. This makes the car look very dull, very plasticky. Here is another example. It shows this bench very clearly, but the happy curly design isn't reflected in the mood of the image. For this next type of mood we will use a black background or near black background, little lights and lots of shadows. It isn't as clear and well defined as the last style, but it does have a lot more feel to it. It is more mysterious and luxurious and looks more expensive. Use a dark background, tone down the environment lighting and use one or two strong light sources. Embrace the shadows, not everything has to be lit completely. Here's a nice example of using colored lights to add drama to the scene. In the same way as how depth of field can bring the focus to a certain detail, you can put a spot lamp on a certain detail and leave the rest of your product in the shadows. This next type is one you can use for flashy and trendy designs. The mood is happy and very bright. By using these bright colors, you indirectly imply that other colors for the product exist. Do keep in mind that sometimes it gives your product a bit of a cheap and disposable feel. Another nice thing to do with your renders is to add them on top of a user. This can be easily done with some image editing. It makes your product feel more real and more accessible. You feel like you can really touch it in real life. You can imagine holding this drill instead of just looking at it. Keep in mind that it doesn't always have to be a human, of course. These are only a few types of renders. I highly recommend doing a little googling for images before deciding to go rendering. When I'm designing a special water hose design, for example, I might first look up some images for gardening products and see what kind of composition, lighting and backgrounds I like. Don't just jump into the default white background. Alright, this video is getting quite long. I hope I haven't bored you to death yet, but if you made it this far, thanks for sticking around. We're nearly there. Here I want to give you some examples of how you can use lighting to bring out details in your design. Now, SolidWorks uses an approach of first adding an HDR image around your scene. Imagine it as a 360-degree image globe surrounding your product, much like what you would see if you're dragging around in Google Street View. This environment lights your object from all angles. Even when you can't see the environment in the render itself, it appears in the reflections on your product. Next to this environment, you have the possibility to add lamps. There are different types of lamps, such as spotlights, point lights and sunlights. These exist in your scene automatically, but have to be turned on separately in Photoview. I will show you how to do this in part 2 of this video. Now, the default lighting in SolidWorks is pretty much okay. You can get very decent results by just tweaking the type of environment, background and floor your render sits on. Changing the position of the lamps is also a good way to better light your model. Take this spinning top for example. Here it is with a 100% grey environment and no separate light sources. It looks very flat and uninteresting, and the detail and curvature is not very clear to see. Here I add a 360-degree image as an environment. Although you can't see this image directly, it affects the reflections on the render significantly. This is looking a bit more interesting already. Then I add what's called a rim light. It's a light placed at the opposite side of your subject. Its effect can be seen on the edges of your product. It helps define contours of your product, as well as bring attention to some of the details, such as the holes on top. Rim lights are most interesting when used on a shiny object. Then I add a fill light. This is a bigger light source to the left or right of the camera. Imagine it as a window letting light into the room. Use it to eliminate dark shadows and brighten the image. Lastly, I add a key light. This is your main light source. Try and position the key light so that it casts interesting shadows as well as highlights. Here the highlights help the viewer understand the complex curvature of your object. These separate lamp types can be edited in both brightness and color. Try not to use white lights all the time. Add a little blue to your fill lights like the outside sky, or some warm yellow to your key light, like a spot lamp that's never 100% cold white. Turn on shadows, especially for your key light, as it helps make the image more realistic. Add some shadow softness to make sure the shadows aren't too sharp, which is very harsh and can be distracting. Alright, that's about enough of the theory. Let's give you some quick examples of some bad and good practices for interesting renders. First off, some don'ts. When rendering a very dark object, like this black painted grinding wheel, don't place it on top of white background. The background blinds the viewer, so that it's harder to look at the detail of your model. Keep in mind that dark tones like these can be low in contrast when they are printed. These are some nice controllers, but they have some buttons on the top, but you can barely see them. The contrast is very low. Add an environment and some lights to get some reflections on these buttons so they stand out more. Move the lights around until they cast highlights and shadows so they can help clarify the shape. While I think this is a cool render, there is only one thing really weird about it. Can you guess it? This gun would never be able to stand on a handle like this. Gravity is a universal law, so don't neglect it, even in this virtual world. Make sure that you place it correctly onto the ground plane, or use no ground plane and make your object float. Since this gun would be laying flat on its edge if you put it on the ground, it would look a little bit sad. I suggest having it float, or even better, adding a cool space alien hand holding it in the air. Using these colors, I suspect that the render is meant to be happy and bright. It should have a lot of liveliness to it. The main reason it doesn't, however, is the background. This 50% grey background should never really be used. It is neither bright nor dark and luxurious. It gives most objects a more dull and uninteresting appearance. When using a render to explain a mechanical system, you should use color to your advantage to show what the different parts are and what they do. In this case, while very realistic, all the metals are a hint of grey and altogether look like a bit of a sad mess. Another sin that I have come across quite often is using too shiny materials. Having an object reflect its surroundings perfectly, like a mirror, is not realistic. All surfaces are a little bit dirty and a little bit rough. Only chrome mirror objects in laboratories might be this shiny. Try to use metals and plastics with a tiny bit of roughness instead, and vary the amount of shininess between parts. Now this is one I mentioned earlier. No real-life object has 100% sharp edges. Definitely not a cast iron part such as this one. Use fillets or the aforementioned round sharp edges feature to allow the lights to create some more realistic highlights on the edges of your model. This last one is a very cool render, but I don't really get it. Are we supposed to look at a chair or at the space gun on top of it? Try to be clear in what you are trying to show. When rendering a game controller on top of a couch, for example, make sure the game controller is the main focus of the image, not the couch. Do this by using depth of field, making the color of the couch not too saturated, and use lighting on the controller and not the couch. Now for some good ideas, some do's. Add some human reference for scale. Without this figure standing next to this transport pod, it might as well be a garlic peeler, or maybe a fancy hotel building. A simple silhouette often does the trick. Here we have the back of some electronic device. Notice the white reflection surrounding the camera and left side of the device. Without this reflection, we would not be able to see the curvature of the back of this phone. This is done by rotating the environment around, adding a light, or even physically modeling a white object above the phone to use for reflections. This cast iron part in itself looks really boring. It is not made to look pretty, but still, by adding the design sketch in the back, it is a more interesting image. Don't draw all the attention away from your product, but use these eye candies to make your product more appealing. This is another good example of eye candy. The product itself, the white and red part, are not so interesting to look at. They do, however, fit the style of lightness and simplicity. Adding these smooth geometric shapes adds a little joy and playfulness without being too distractive. Here is an example of good use of depth of field and camera angle. You can clearly see the view that you would have if you were using this mopping device. The display is in clear view, but the rest of the model, of which the shape is not important to the user, is blurred by being out of focus. Now here's an example of interesting composition. The render is symmetric and made very close up. You can feel the booming sounds coming out of the speakers. The symmetry helps to make the speakers look big and powerful, something you wouldn't have if these speakers would point elsewhere. Now, if it is possible, you should always try and tell a story with your render. Here we can see a remote-controlled off-road race car. In itself, it looks very technical and it lacks some character. In this render, however, we can imagine ourselves sitting at a desk, repairing this toy and swapping some components. It has a bit of a DIY property to it. That's how I would describe it. That is what I mean by a story. Don't just show your product, show it being used, being built, show it being explored by someone. With this very last image, I want to show what an in situ render is. It's when you put a product, often something larger, like this vending machine, in its environment being used by a person. This render type can be a little more tricky to pull off, but comes across as very convincing when done right. Always keep in mind that you have your product as your main focus. That's why we have the very bright yellow in this picture. Always be sure to match the perspective and lighting of the scene and try to add realistic shadows and reflections. I will be showing you how to make a render like this in one of my next tutorials. Well, that's a wrap. I want to thank you all for watching this tutorial, and if you made it this far, even if you haven't, your support means a lot to me. You can leave all of your questions, comments, criticisms and ideas down in the comments and on my Facebook page at facebook.com/3dpilot. Thank you so much, and I hope to catch you in the next one. Bye!